this is International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com, and today I'll be doing the second part of my series on exchange sacrifices on c3 for black in the Sicilian. The first part of my series dealt with the exchange sacrifice in the Scheveningen structure, and this is the second part. We'll be dealing with the exchange sacrifice in the dragon. So first part I showed the game Gilberto Milos versus Judith Polgar, and in this game I'll be showing, in this lecture I'll be showing another game, Isaac Boleslavsky versus Yefim Geller. And the exchange sacrifice in the dragon is, some of the themes are a little bit different than in the Scheveningen. For one thing, it's much more common. I would say in a Yugoslav attack versus the dragon, it's more common for black to sacrifice the exchange than not. So, very common. Most games have some exchange sacrifice on c3. So you can, it's a part of opening theory. In a lot of lines, it's simply part of the opening theory that black sacrifices on c3. And there's a few differences. For one thing, white's e pawn is more closely guarded, so black doesn't win the e pawn. Anyway, for example, in this is one variation that's part of theory where this exchange sacrifice happens. I'll show you some of the type of compensation black gets. So we have a dragon. This is not the game the Boleslavsky game. This is just an opening variation. For example, f3, castles, queen to d2, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop d7, castles, knight e5, bishop b3, queen a5. This is one of the lines black plays. Now, for example, h4, rook f to c8, king b1. Actually, it's better to set after g4. For example, g4, rook f to c8, king b1. Here, one possible move for black, rook takes c3. And then we'll see some of the type of compensation black gets. It's natural to want to trade queens for white. Queen takes c3, queen takes c3, b takes c3. And here we have a position where black's simply down the exchange, but this shows in the dragon structure, black essentially has no weaknesses. I mean, his pawn structure is virtually perfect. The one problem is that typically the d5 square is a problem, because if you guard it with e6, you do create a weakness, and the d6 pawn becomes backward on the open file and not protected by a bishop because the bishop's on g7. But by sacrificing the exchange on c3, black has removed the knight, so that can come to d5, so there's really no problem with the d5 square. So black has absolutely solid structure. And here, of course, it would probably be not as good to play it after some move other than g4, because here it's important thing that black is attacking the f3 square. The f3 pawn is now weak. And actually black has pretty good play here. Down the exchange, but happily play this position for black. White's bishop on b3 also has no real target. And so the thing is, white has no open lines for his rooks that can be used. The d file is solidly blocked by black with the d6 pawn well defended. The b file is not worth anything to white. So really the rooks are no better than black's minor pieces in this position. This is something that people realized when the dragon started becoming popular. Now if, for example, white takes back with a pawn to continue hoping for an attack on the king side, of course his king is weakened, so this is another typical reason for the exchange sacrifice of black. With the queens on, white's king is not as safe, and now black has a typical combination: knight takes f3, knight takes f3, knight takes e4. So down a whole rook, but white's queen is under attack, and c3 is going to be taken with check. g4 pawn is also hanging, so black is going to get an enormous attack here, probably just winning. So this is one opening variation. Now let's get to the main game. So this game was Boleslavsky versus Geller from the Zurich 1953 Candidates Tournament. Game began e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6. This is not the typical way of reaching the dragon. Of course, this was 1953. They hadn't exactly perfected the move order. So d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now g6 would be the accelerated dragon, which of course gives white the opportunity of playing c4 and creating a Maroczy bind. This is has whole different themes, different type of position entirely. But Geller played knight f6, knight c3, and now d6. And generally this is what's known as the classical Sicilian. White, and the point is it's not typically used if someone wants to reach a dragon from this position, because white can play bishop g5, going into a Richter rouser, and g6 is not so great because bishop takes f6. Also, bishop c4. An important trap to know is that if g6, trying to get into a dragon from here, black gets in trouble after knight takes c6, b takes c6, e5. And he can't take the pawn because bishop takes f7 check. So not typically the way that black reaches the dragon, but back then, bishop c4 and bishop g5 were not yet as common. So actually, Boleslavsky played the move g3. And now what Geller played was a slightly unusual move here. Some moves, g6 would just go into the regular dragon with g3 variation, but he played the unique move bishop g4. And this, well, there's some move order things here. It turns out that this reaches pretty much forces white to go into a Yugoslav attack, but black loses one option. Now white needs to play f3. Since if he plays bishop e2, this is just not so good with shading these bishops with the g-pawn on g3. Knight d to e2 would be met by bishop f3. So white has to play f3, and now bishop d7. So black has created this weakness, and it wouldn't make as much sense for white to now play bishop g2 and castle. So he played move bishop e3, and now g6. So through a little weird move order, we're going to get to a mainline position. So queen to d2, bishop g7, castles queenside, castles, and now g4. So this is a type of variation of the dragon where white doesn't play bishop c4. I showed you before a line with bishop c4. Here white is castling right away, and usually black meets this in the normal move order by a pawn sacrifice d5. So we would get this position where black's bishop is on c8 and white's pawn is on g2, and now d5 is a common option here. Pawn sacrifice invented by Konstantinopolsky. But here black has lost that option. On the other hand, he got the position into a Yugoslav attack, which is what he wanted, I guess. So now here black played rook to c8, bringing his rook to the open file. King b1, typical move to get the king off the c file. Very often played by white in the dragon. And now knight e5, bringing the knight to good square where it's putting pressure on f3 in some cases, g4. Also maybe we'll go into c4 at some point. Also clearing the c file. And now h4. White's doing his attack, h4, h5. Common idea, the main idea of the Yugoslav. And here Geller played, I think, good move b5. If he plays, for example, knight c4, what happens in this is basically, in the other line where white plays bishop c4 and bishop b3, white saves 2 tempi. White simply takes, and he's up 2 tempi, which is deadly for black in such a sharp variation. So that's why this is why people usually play this pawn sacrifice by Konstantinopolsky, because here simply going into c4 and trading off white's bishop is just not good for black. So he has to kind of rely on some sacrifices. Sometimes there's one line, queen a5, and if h5, rook takes c3. This is another possible line for black. Queen takes c3. This is this exchange sacrifice. And here then black continues. Knight takes f3. Knight takes f3. Bishop takes g4, hitting the knight. And for example, bishop e2, knight takes e4. Black's down a whole rook, but he has got already, I think, 4 pawns. He's getting a 5th one. And actually he has 3 pawns, but he's going to be getting a 4th one and possibly a 5th one. And in general, white's pieces don't coordinate so well, and black has beautiful pawn chain on the king's side. he'll have 3 connected passed pawns, very unclear position. So, but in this game, Geller chose the move b5. And of course, this is a sort of pawn sacrifice, although not really so much, because white doesn't necessarily want to take this with the opening up the b file. In Dragon, initiative is worth much more than material here. So b5, and now Boleslavsky played the move bishop h6. And now black did a typical operation here. Bishop takes h6. Seems a little strange to draw white's queen up into threatening position, but he has a point. Queen takes h6, and now rook takes c3. So this is the exchange sacrifice that we're discussing. B takes c3, and queen a5. And we'll see what kind of... I can't say that the play is absolutely correct here. Boleslavsky played queen e3. It might have been worth trying h5 here. Although still, I'm not so sure. After queen takes c3, I think black gets good compensation. Knight c4 possibly coming soon, and then the rook will be coming to the b file. So he played queen e3, guarding the c-pawn. And now Geller played move queen a3. So he's preparing knight c4 in some cases to open up the b file. And he's also preparing the move, threatening the move b4. So a couple different threats. And we see that black has diverted white from his attack on the king side to some extent, and this is the whole point. Endgames are typically okay for black. So he played, anyway, Boleslavsky played h5, and now b4. So planning to simply take on c3, and white needed to seek an exchange of queens, so he played queen c1, queen takes c3, queen to b2. So using this queen to defend over here. And I suppose black could actually keep the queens on somehow. Queen to c5 perhaps. But he simply played rook c8, showing the endgame is okay for black too. He already has one pawn for the exchange. He has the same type of invulnerable pawn structure on the king side as we saw before, and white's f3 pawn is in some danger. So rook c8, h takes g6, and now simply queen takes b2. He simply went into the endgame. And we'll see how black stands well in this endgame. King takes b2, h takes g6. So down the exchange, but where's white's play going to come? He can't do a lot on the queen side, and he has to worry about the f3 pawn, and also in some cases the g4 pawn. And his h file is not worth a whole lot actually. Black can easily defend all the entry squares on the h file. And here black is planning to play perhaps g5 at some point. So if white just plays also bishop e2, rook to c3 is a good move, stopping a3. So here Boleslavsky decided he needed to open up some sort of line, so he played the move a3. But it's funny, I chose this game. There are a lot of games I could have chosen with an exchange sacrifice in the Sicilian, in the Dragon for black. And I chose this game because it was kind of unique, and it kind of struck me how the typical Dragon tactics continued well into the endgame. Things that you see usually on move 18, you see much later in this game. The structure just keeps its nature, and the same sort of tactics come up. So here, b takes a3, king takes a3, and then just like I showed you before, the sacrifice on f3. Of course, here it's not even a sacrifice. It's just if white takes it, then rook c3. So here it's clear white's in trouble. White's structure is falling apart. He's going to be left with all isolated pawns against black's beautiful kingside pawn structure. g6, f7, e7, d6. So white took on f3. And now rook c3, king b2, rook takes f3. So he now has 2 pawns for the exchange, and white's pawns on g4 and e4 are weak. But here, white needed to... Now, white's typical tactic that you see a lot in the dragon. He played e5, which you usually see much earlier in the game. The point is, if d takes e5, then g5 attacks the knight, and the d7 bishop is hanging. So this is a common thing for white. But now knight takes g4, and if e takes d6, then knight f2, and winning back the exchange. And d1 is hanging with check also. So what white played after knight takes g4 is bishop e2, and now black played rook f2, so counterattacking the bishop, and white played bishop takes g4, and bishop takes g4, again hitting the rook. And if e takes d6, then bishop takes d1, and black stops a pawn, for example, d7, rook d1, rook d2. Or d takes d7, then rook e2, and black wins with two connected passed pawns. So white played after bishop takes g4, he played rook d to f1, and perhaps he should have tried move rook d4, counterattacking black's bishop, and then black plays bishop f5, hitting the c-pawn, e takes d6, rook takes c2 check, king b3, e takes d6, rook takes d6, but here I think black should win pretty easily. No problem, really. 3 pawns for the exchange, and again, white's rooks, even in this simplified position, have no scope. So he played rook d to f1, and now it was a fairly simple win for black. Rook takes f1, rook takes f1, d takes c5, and c4. White's counting on this passed c-pawn to give him some chances, but it's not much. King f8, simply running over with the king to stop the pawn. And now white played rook a1, bishop f3. So his bishop is ideally placed to support the pawns. And you know, it's kind of interesting, but someone who knows something could look at this position and see that it came from a dragon. You could probably guess. So rook takes a7, actually bishop f3, c5 he played. And now g5, rook takes a7, g4, rook a3, trying to stop a pawn from advancing, and king e8, simply moving the king over to stop the c-pawn, king c1, f5, king d2, f4, and black is now threatening g3, rook takes f3, g2, queening the pawn. So he played rook a6. After g3, king e1, bishop e4. White resigned in view of f3, f2 is unstoppable, followed by bishop check. So this shows some of the themes for black in exchange sacrifice, showing that that even the endgame is often very good for black, simply due to the lack of open lines for white's rooks, his doubled c-pawns, and black's pressure on white's kingside pawns, as well as black's simply very strong pawn structure on the kingside. So this has been International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com.